Welcome to the Daily Decameron, Tales to Connect Us in Troubled Times. Episode 9, A Ghost Story. Please be advised that this episode includes descriptions of acts of violence that may not be appropriate for all listeners. Boccaccio created the character Nastagio degli Onesti, but it was another great artist, Sandro Botticelli, who put Nastagio on the map a century and a half later, bringing him colorfully and vividly to life. For a commission in honor of the wedding of two Florentine nobles, Botticelli created a series of 4 panels depicting episodes from Boccaccio's tale, the images you'll be seeing in this episode. The ghost story at the center of the tale, 2 lovers condemned to repeat a deadly game of cat and mouse, was likely inspired by an episode from the 13th canto of Dante's Inferno, the forest of the suicides, where the souls of those who took their own lives are turned into trees that are ravaged by harpies and torn apart, only to be reborn to undergo the same torture over and over again for eternity. Boccaccio sets his version of this infernal hunt not in hell, but in a beautiful forest near the city of Ravenna, and ultimately his version is not a tale of darkness, but one of light, a tale of terror that teaches the heart to love. Quinta giornata, Novella ottava, Nastagio degli Onesti. The 5th day, the 8th novella, the tale of Nastagio degli Onesti. There once lived in Ravenna, that ancient city of Romagna, a young nobleman named Nastagio degli Onesti, who became wealthy beyond measure after the death of his father and his uncle. Nastagio fell in love with a beautiful young woman, a daughter of Paolo Traversari, the patriarch of a family far nobler than his own. But perhaps because of her rare beauty, or perhaps because of her exalted rank, this young woman despised Nastagio. The more he tried to win her heart, the haughtier and more disdainful she became, and the more she scorned him, the more his love increased. In despair, he thought time and again of taking his own life, and as he went on in this way, pining and spending extravagantly, his friends and relations, seeing that he was wasting his youth and his fortune, begged him to leave Ravenna and start a new life somewhere else. Finally, when he felt he could suffer no longer, he took their advice to heart. He made elaborate preparations as if he were going to France or Spain or some faraway land, climbed onto his horse, and set out, in the company of many friends and servants, for a place called Chiassi, not 3 miles outside Ravenna. There he set up a lavish encampment in the woods with tents and pavilions, and he lived as fine and elegant a life as anyone could imagine, inviting his friends to dine and sport with him in high style. But, try as he might, he couldn't get his cruel love out of his mind. One fine May morning, he walked out alone into the pine forest. As the noon hour approached, he wandered through the woods, lost in his thoughts of the woman he loved. But suddenly, he was startled out of his trance by the shrieking cries of a woman in distress. Looking up, he saw, running toward him through the brambles, a beautiful young lady. She was naked, her hair in disarray, her flesh torn by briars and thorns, and she was weeping and crying out for mercy as she ran. Behind her came 2 fierce and enormous mastiffs, and every so often they would catch up with her and bite her ferociously. And right behind them came a knight in armor on a massive stallion, brandishing a sword and threatening the woman with words of murderous menace. His heart filled with fear and horror, Nastagio tore a branch from a tree and rushed to save the poor woman from her tormentor. But when the knight saw this, he called out to him from afar, "Nastagio, stand back! Let me and my dogs give this wicked woman what she deserves." No sooner had he said this than the dogs got hold of the woman, and the knight dismounted from his horse in front of her. Nastagio rushed toward them, saying, "I don't know who you are or how you know my name, but I do know that it is most base and vile for a knight in armor to set his dogs on a woman and hunt her down like a wild animal, and I will do whatever I can to save her." Then the knight said, Nastagio, I was from the same town as you, and you were but a child when I, Messer Guido degli Anastagi, fell madly in love with this woman, far more than you are with your Traversari girl. But her haughtiness and her cruelty drove me to such desperation that one day I took this very sword and used it to take my own life. For that sin, I am condemned to eternal damnation. But she rejoiced beyond measure at my death, but not for long, for she died soon after, and for the sin of her cruelty and the delight she took in my demise, she too was condemned to the pains of hell, and our shared punishment is this. She must flee from me, and I, who had loved her so much, must pursue her like my mortal enemy, and every time I catch her, I must kill her with this sword that I used to kill myself, and then tear out her cold, unfeeling heart and feed it to my hounds. But as you will see, after a short time, she is resurrected, and her wretched flight begins again, with the dogs and me pursuing her. And as it happens every Friday at this time, we reach this spot. And so it must continue, over and over again, for as many years as the months she was cruel to me. And now, I must ask you to stand back and not interfere with this divine sentence, which you are powerless to prevent. These words filled Nastagio's heart with terror and made his hair stand on end. He stepped back in horror, waiting to see what would happen next. The knight leapt down from his horse, pounced upon the woman who was kneeling and pleading for mercy, and ran his sword straight through her chest. She fell to the ground, still weeping and screaming, whereupon the knight took his dagger in hand, slit open her back, tore out her heart, and threw it to his ravenous dogs, who devoured it in an instant. But then, not a moment later, the woman stood up as if nothing had happened, and started running off toward the sea, the dogs again biting her flesh, and the knight chasing after them, and before long, Nastagio lost sight of them as they ran off into the distance. Nastagio stood rooted to that spot for a long while, in a state of stunned fear and sadness. But then, a new thought entered his mind. If this horrific spectacle took place every Friday at this time, it might well be useful to him. And so he marked the spot and returned to his encampment. Then he sent for his friends and relatives from Ravenna, and when they had come, he gathered them all together and said, "For some time you have all begged me to give up my love for my cruel and heartless lady and stop my extravagant spending. And this I am prepared to do, if you will all agree to do me one favor. I ask you to invite Messer Paolo Traversari and his wife and daughter and all their relations to dine with me this Friday." This seemed to them a small thing to ask, and so they returned to Ravenna and extended Nastagio's invitation to the whole of the Traversari family, and after some persuading, even the young lady Nastagio loved agreed to come along. And so Nastagio had a grand banquet prepared, with the tables arranged under the pines at the very place where he had witnessed the terrifying hunt of the lady and the knight, and he had a place set for the woman he loved directly in front of that spot. And so it was that just after the last course had been served, all the guests began to hear the desperate shrieks of a woman, and before long they saw the wretched girl running toward them, and the dogs and the knight on his stallion right behind her. Horrified, they began screaming at the dogs and rushing forward to help the girl, but the knight forced them to draw back, terrifying them with the same gruesome story he had told Nastagio. And then he did to the girl exactly what he had done the week before. The guests, many of whom were relatives of the suffering girl or of the knight, and all of whom remembered well their tragic love affair, began to weep piteously. And then, just like the time before, the girl rose up and the chase began again. When the girl and the knight had vanished into the distance, the guests sat in stunned silence, and the most terrified among them was the cruel young lady Nastagio loved, because she knew that everything they had seen and heard applied to her more than anyone else. and as she recalled the cruelty she had always inflicted on Nastagio, she could almost feel the terror of fleeing from him, his dogs lunging at her legs. And this terror was so great that it transformed her hatred into love. So that very evening she sent one of her handmaids in secret to Nastagio, begging him on her behalf to come and see her, for she was now prepared to do anything he wished. Nastagio sent back his reply, telling the lady that he was delighted by this offer, but that he wished to preserve her honor, and asking if she would agree to marry him. The girl sent a message that she would gladly be Nastagio's wife, and she went straight away to her parents to tell them the news, which pleased them greatly. And so, the following Sunday, Nastagio degli Onesti married his one true love, and they lived happily together for many years to come. But this was not the only good that came from that terrible apparition. For indeed, all of the women of Ravenna had had such a fright that day that they became a good deal more friendly to the men in their lives than they had ever been before. Thanks for listening to The Daily Decameron, a production of the Italian Cultural Institute of San Francisco. Anna Maria Di Giorgio, director. This program was produced by Franca Cavallaro and edited by Enrica Cavalli, with music performed by John Sayles. I'm your host and translator, Steve Siegelman. We hope you'll join us for more episodes in both English and Italian. Till next time, stay well, stay connected, and share your favorite stories with the people you love.